Chapter 7. The Ibex Hunt. Old Mother and Avni were still calling when she reached the cave. Old Mother smiled and led her inside. Tikek was lying on the furs, her hair draggled and stuck to her face with sweat. She was too tired to speak, but her eyes were bright. The baby lay in the crook of her arm, asleep. Maroo stared at its crumpled old man's face. "It is a son," Old Mother said, as proudly as if she had borne it herself. The men and children arrived and crowded around. Nime pushed her way to the front, and Ereg began at once to make up a new song. Old Mother shooed them all away, all except Avni and Maroo, who was allowed to stay, crouched beside her mother, watching the baby. Outside, she could hear Nime's voice and the tapping of Ereg's finger on the drum. The next day, Tikek got up. She made a sling for the baby from a strip of hide tied around her body and carried him on her back, feeding him whenever he cried. Mostly he slept. Nime was sent to find soft leaves and moss to tuck inside his fur wrap and keep him dry, and that became her daily task. Tikek soon began to recover her strength, but she was still too weak to travel. Maroo knew that they should have been on their way west already. The mornings were cold now, and the last of the fruits and berries had been picked. That night, the adults talked together and decided that Sovi's group should leave the next day and that Ereg's group would follow in their trail a few days later. They had a feast of lemmings roasted on sticks over the fire, and the next morning Sovi's group rolled up their furs and took the trail to the west. The children clambered to the cliff top and watched until they were out of sight. It was 2 days later that Ereg's group took up the trail. The children were sorry to leave the beach. They ran about by the edge of the sea until the last moment, watching the seal people bobbing in the choppy water. They were far out now, and the sea was breaking around them in tufts of white foam. Ereg shouted command, brought the children running up the beach, with Revo bounding beside them. Maroo took up her bundle. Somewhere inside it was a small bag full of shells, where she would spend the winter sewing onto a new fur jacket, using the traditional patterns that Old Mother had taught her. Because Tikek tired easily, they traveled more slowly than the others and did not reach the site of Sovi's first campfire until the middle of the second day. The distance between the two groups gradually increased, but every night they saw the fire from each other's fire, and Sovi would leave signs and messages for Ereg. Once in Sovi's fireplace, they found a pattern of sticks and stones that meant there is good fishing downstream by the flat rocks. Ereg and Vorka went to the place and caught 3 salmon, and that night they sent a signal to Sovi by fanning the fire with a hide so that the smoke went up in bursts. Sometimes Sovi would leave a drawing scratched on the stone. One simply told him, "We tracked a fine buck, but he got away." Another warned them to beware of marshy land lower down the hillside. Sovi's trail went high up into the mountains, and the way was often steep because Tikek was still weak. Ereg turned off the trail and chose a lower path that made traveling easier. That night, they found for the first time since the journey began that they could not see a signal fire ahead of them. They had stopped on a large plateau with big tumbled boulders around that would make good shelter, and a high sheer rock wall to the northeast. Although it was sheltered, the place seemed unfriendly, in a way Maroo could not explain. Perhaps it was just that they felt lonely without a sign from the other group. Ereg made a tune on the drum, and they began to sing and clap. They started loudly, but the voices petered out and hands paused until only Nime was still clapping. "Shh," Tikek told her. Everyone was staring at the rock wall. Someone over there had been singing and clapping with them. Ereg clapped loudly and experimentally. Back came the answer from the rock wall. There was silence. Maroo felt her hair lifting. She could smell fear. Even Old Mother was afraid. Revel stood erect, growling. They all turned to Old Mother, looking for guidance. "It is a spirit," she said. "Sometimes a high rock like this is the home of a calling spirit." "Will it harm us?" Vorka did not sound hopeful. Maroo wondered if he, too, sensed the atmosphere of the place. "I don't know," Old Mother said, "but I have always felt afraid of them." "Perhaps we should not camp here," suggested Areg. They looked around. It was dusk already. There were no other sheltered places near, and Tikek was very tired. "We must stay here," Old Mother decided. "We will leave a gift for the spirit." The men had a good catch of fish, speared earlier in the day. Areg took the two largest fish and carried them cautiously across the stony ground to the foot of the rock wall. He made a ring of pebbles and placed the offering inside it. Then he came back, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Now we must eat," said Old Mother briskly. They cooked the two remaining fish and broke them into several pieces. Old Mother also shared out dried meat and some dry withered berries. They were still hungry afterward. They had caught fish a few times, but had not tasted fresh meat since they left the sea. Old Mother tended the fire while Tikek suckled the baby, and the two men made a rough shelter among some boulders opposite the high rock wall. Old Mother left the fire burning brighter than usual. They guessed it was meant to be a precaution against evil spirits, although she said nothing. Maroo crawled into the tiny space where they all huddled together for warmth and rolled herself up in her furs. She lay with her face toward the entrance. Between her and the menacing rock wall was the flicker of the fire and the reassuring silhouette of Vorka, who was keeping the first watch. Above the rock wall, she could see a strip of starry sky. One star was brighter than all the others. Iremgadu, the evening star. She thought of Old Mother, who was named Iremgadu after the star. Old Mother had said once that she always felt protected when she could see her star. Maroo fell asleep, watching it. She woke in the night and looked out. The darkness was absolute. She sensed that the weather had changed. All but one or two of the stars had been swallowed up by the night. The wind was angry and howled among the rocks above the shelter. There was another sound, too, a throaty animal rumbling. The fire had died down to red embers, with worms of blackened wood twisting and falling into it. She could see nothing beyond its faint glow. She was frightened and curled up tight against Old Mother, hiding her eyes. Almost at once, it seemed, she was awake again. The night had gone, leaving the sky starless and full of streaming clouds. It was early. The sun was still sleeping. The fire was a heap of gray ash. Vorka's place had been taken by Old Mother. Old Mother, who always woke early, preferred to take the last watch of the night. It had been a cramped night, and everyone was stirring uncomfortably. Maroo found that her legs were numb. Revel was lying across them. He trotted out when she moved. Old Mother laid a hand on her arm. "See, the gift has gone." Maroo peered into the dimness at the foot of the cliff. It was hard to see yet, but she thought Old Mother was right. Areg came out next. "I heard the spirit come," he said. "While I was watching in the night, Revel was awake. He growled when the spirit came." Maroo followed him as he went cautiously toward the offering place to investigate. The ring of stones was broken, and the fish had been dragged out and eaten. There were no prints on the rocky ground, but there was a smelling linger, cat-like, Maroo thought, lynx or cave lion. Areg agreed. "Came as a great cat," he said. Maroo imagined a gigantic lynx with great yellow eyes and claws curved and gleaming like the new moon. Areg led the way back to the camp. Vorka was outside now, and he and Areg made a circuit of the camp, looking at the morning, as they called it. The children followed them, and the men pointed out to them the signs they must learn to recognize. a crevice in the rock where owls were nesting, betrayed by regurgitated balls of fur and feathers nearby. Areg picked one up and showed the children that the owl had eaten voles and a hare. In another crevice, the smell of fox was strong. Higher up, they found droppings, clumps of small black pellets. Ibex, Vorka said, not aloud, but by making the ibex sign with his hands. Even when they were not hunting, they avoided talking when possible. Old Mother had a saying, the hunters who chatters will catch only carrion. Further on, Otak spotted the print of a cloven hoof in some damp moss. The men were pleased with him. The droppings were everywhere. Clearly, a large group were grazing here. The man began to talk of a hunt. Maroo felt saliva run in her mouth at the thought of meat. But when they returned to the campfire, Old Mother was uneasy. 2 men were not enough to hunt ibex, she said, and Sylvie was too far ahead now to be called. Vorka began to look doubtful, but Areg laughed away his fears. They were hungry for meat, and the signs of ibex were rich on the ground. Perhaps the rock spirit was grateful for their gift, and had brought the ibex to them. It is unwise, said Old Mother, to hunt large game when the group is so small. But Maroo could see that the thought of meat tempted her, and perhaps Areg was right, and the rock spirit intended it. At last she agreed. Areg was glad. He pretended to be an ibex and butted Nime, who shouted with laughter. Vorka was won over by Areg's confidence, and they made ready at once, sharpening their spears and planning how and where to trap the ibex. Otak wanted to go with them and bring Revo, but the men said no. Even without Revo, they would not allow Otak to go. It was too dangerous. All Otak could do was to sit close by them and listen to their plans, so he could impress his sisters later with details of the hunt. The children watched as Areg brought out 2 horns, one filled with red stuff and the other with black. The stuff was earth mixed with fat to make a paste. The brothers dipped their fingers into the paste and painted each other's faces with the patterns of stripes and diamonds. When Areg turned and looked at Nime out of his new strange face, she backed away and clung to Maroo. Maroo laughed, but she too was a little afraid of the changed faces. The man was Areg, and yet not only Areg, he had become an ibex. The men took up their spears and began climbing higher up the mountains. Soon they were out of sight. The camp was quiet without them. Otak found the horns of colored paste and began painting his face. The girls played quiet games, building tiny shelters with bits of bone or rolling stones and knocking them against each other to see who could win the most. They dared not shout or laugh because when they did, the rock spirit shouted back. The children climbed around and collected some withered fruits, a basket of nuts, and a few sticks of firewood. Maroo found mushrooms growing in a grassy patch where water ran down. She gave them all to Kek, who was always hungry now because of the baby. The baby whimpered constantly for milk, and Kek fed him, and in between times she mended clothes, while Old Mother put a new handle on a basket. At dusk, the men had not returned. Her mother said, "It is nothing. They will sleep out and hunt again in the morning." But Maroo sensed her anxiety. She looked at the rock wall looming up dark and strange in the fading light and wished she had not given all the mushrooms to her mother. There was nothing to offer the spirit except dried meat, and they had little enough of that. But Old Mother took some, remade the ring of stones, and placed it inside. Then they were each given a portion to eat and water to drink from the spring higher up the mountain. They crept under their shelter to sleep. Everybody was hungry. Maroo took the first watch with Revo beside her. Her stomach growled its protest as she sat chewing a hard root. Maroo was afraid. She sensed that something was wrong. The 2 women seemed anxious. The hunters might stay away at night, as Old Mother had said, but not when there was no man or strong young woman to protect the family. She listened to the night. straining to hear any sound of the hunters. Perhaps they were near, in one of the little caves higher up. She heard the cry of an owl hunting, and the high piping of bats, and once she tensed in fear when she thought she heard a low cat-like growl. Revel stood up, ears erect, but the sound did not come again. There was no human voice, but then Arag and Vorka would not talk above a whisper, and they moved as softly as hares. The owl hooted again, and from the rock wall its voice was thrown back mockingly. Maroo crouched close to the fire for comfort and poked at it with a stick, so that the shower of sparks shot up briefly and hid the wall. She longed for her watch to end, but it was not yet time to wake Otak. The moon was her guide to the time, and when it reached the highest point of the ridge, she was to wake him. Tonight the moon was newborn and gave scarcely any light. Irem-Gadu shone brightly. Maroo was comforted by the sights of Irem-Gadu. If the star had been hidden by a cloud, she would have felt more threatened by the rock spirit. She was sure that the rock spirit was bad, even though it had brought them the Ibex. The baby cried, breaking the night's stillness. Maroo heard Tekek stirring and shushing the child. Tekek raised herself on one elbow. "Who is watching?" she whispered. "Maroo." The moon was still far from the highest ridge, but Tekek said, "You sleep now, Maroo. I will watch and wake Otak later. How was the night?" "I heard an owl and bats and perhaps a lion. Irem-Gadu is bright," she added, unnecessarily. She sensed Tekek's smile at that. "Good. Go to sleep." Maroo patted Revo and went into the shelter and changed places with her mother. The baby was already attached to Tekek's breast and sucking with little gasps of contentment. Tekek crawled out, holding him on one arm, and squatted beside the fire. Maroo settled into her space where the furs were warm from her body. She woke to the familiar sight of old mother fixing the bone pins in her coiled hair. The stones were heating in the fire, and Nimue was handing nuts around. "You must search for the men," Nimue said importantly. Maroo felt cold inside. She looked at old mother. Old mother turned around, and Maroo saw that she was afraid. "They should have returned," old mother said. "We must find them today." She said no more, but dropped the hot stones into the bone bowl full of water flavored with herbs, then tipped the hot liquid into the drinking bowl and passed it first to Tekek. Tekek sipped and passed it back. Only when everyone had drunk did old mother tell Maroo to fetch a coil of twisted hide rope and Otak to fetch his spear. Tekek and Nimue would stay behind, she said, in case the men came back. Old mother led the way up the mountain. Maroo and Otak followed, and Revo running beside them. The trail was hard to find. The hunters were skilled and left few clues, but they all began casting about, and soon Maroo found a footprint in a damp moss. Revo sniffed at the footprint and trotted off fast, with his nose to the ground. "He had found the trail," Otak whispered. The three of them followed the dog, who ran on unchecked. The trail wound a long way among the high rocks, and all about were the prints and droppings of Ibex. Once, as they reached the top of a hill, there was an abrupt clatter of hooves, and they saw the white rumps of several Ibex darting away. They went on, still following the dog. Revo was some way ahead of them when he stopped. He seemed to be on the edge of a cliff. He looked back at them and barked. As they hurried toward him, Maroo thought she heard a human voice. They reached Revo and looked over the edge. The ground fell away steeply, forming a small cliff. Vorka was trapped halfway down. When he stood up, they saw that his right arm hung oddly as if it were broken. And then Maroo looked past Vorka and saw something else, the huddled shape of a reg lying at the foot of the cliff.